Yo guys, what is up? Max on our Borderlands 4 video, and today we are going to be going over the licensed part system in depth. Now, I made a video yesterday talking about my first impressions of playing Borderlands 4, and I left out the licensed part system because it is such a massive change to the Borderlands formula. If you're not aware of what the licensed part system is, it is basically the ability for any weapon to roll with any part on that weapon from a different manufacturer that augments and changes the way that the weapon operates. So you could get a Maliwan SMG that rolls with a Jacobs part that makes that Maliwan SMG ricochet on critical hits. Or maybe it ricochets on critical hits, and those ricochets apply Torgue stickies because it has a sticky part. It's a massive shakeup to the game, and it's a lot different when you actually get to experience that system versus just kind of like hearing about how it works, because there's actually a lot more intricacies than they even said there are. And I've gotten some real like in-depth information now about the system, so we're going to be doing a full deep dive. I hope you guys enjoy the breakdown. Let's get right into it. So the licensed parts system, pretty easy to understand on paper. Different weapons and different pieces of gear can roll with different parts, and those different parts imprint their specific characteristics on them to create crazy, wacky, goofy combinations of gear. In actual practice, it's a little bit more complicated than that. So, for example, certain manufacturer parts are not going to start dropping until later. So, for example, you're not going to find like an order part on a piece of gear until I believe they said like level 12. So just they're kind of going to ease players into this system, as well as it seems like the rolls on parts. For example, a purple piece of gear can roll with 4 different parts. It doesn't mean that a purple piece of gear will roll with 4 parts, if that makes sense. So one thing that I noticed in my playtime is that when I leveled up, I was finding more parts on my gear. Like when I progressed further into the game, I was finding more parts on my gear. But if I found like a purple at level 9, that purple would pretty much have like 1 weapon part on it. But if I found a purple at like level 20, that purple would then have like 3 additional parts on it. So it does seem like, you know, even though you could get a crazy weapon with 4 parts technically at like level 5, they do kind of ease everyone into that system where as you level up, you'll slowly start to see more weapon parts and more things rolling on pieces of gear. Now, my bigger confusion with the licensed part system, which I now have direct answers from Gearbox about, is can any, for example, Jacobs part on a weapon grant that weapon the ability to ricochet? And that is not the case. Every manufacturer has a specific part that they are licensing out to other manufacturers to grant them additional benefits. For example, you can't get a like Jacobs loader mag, which allows you to load like a lot of bullets at one time into a Ripper weapon, but you can get a Jacobs barrel that grants ricochets. For Torgue, it is the magazine. You have to get a Torgue magazine license part in order to get stickies on your weapon. It's not like a Torgue sight could grant you the sticky attachments in your ammo. So the license part system does have some restrictions, but you can still roll different parts from different manufacturers that grant you benefits, but they're not licensed benefits. So if you're familiar with Borderlands 3 or Borderlands 2's part system, you can roll different parts on different pieces of gear that will grant you a benefit, such as rolling a matching grip on a weapon, which would give you more damage in Borderlands 2. That system still is in existence. The like random rolling of parts on weapons and trying to get like a matching grip or this sight or this mag, that is still very much in existence and in play, and you can still farm for like a god roll in terms of getting like specific weapon parts, but not every part is going to be a licensed part. A Jacobs part can show up on a weapon that isn't a licensed part that can grant like a small passive benefit, such as like a reload speed or a crit damage increase, but it won't grant that weapon a ricochet. Only a, for example, Jacobs barrel will grant a weapon ricochets, and only a Torgue magazine will grant a weapon stickies. So every weapon in Borderlands 4 is going to be a combination of passive boosts from certain manufacturers that roll on that gun and license parts that grant the gun more tangible and visible changes like ricochets or like explosives. Now, legendary weapons and legendary pieces of gear also follow a bit of a different rule. This is a complex route. The complex route is returning, which is insane because the complex route was one of the most broken weapons in Borderlands history. But it is confirmed coming back in Borderlands 4. But the big way that like legendary pieces of gear are going to work is their legendary attribute, what makes the complex route, which fires all those like ricocheting crazy laser things. That is a weapon part. So it's like the complex route, but it has this legendary part that makes it the complex route, and then it can roll other things. But that complex route roll takes up a slot. So, for example, how they've described it is a purple piece of gear is going to have the availability to get 4 parts, and a legendary piece of gear is going to have 3 parts, but I believe that 3 parts is the legendary part plus 3 others. So it's just a little bit less variability on your legendaries because they're always going to have the like unique legendary perk or part that makes them that. As we can see with the complex route, it's got Serpinski, spawns additional diverging projectiles along its path, and then this also rolled Malawan with shock and corrosive. Now, where the license part system gets even crazier is actually when it comes to Ordinance, because Ordinance has its own rule set and its own mods and everything that it can roll that are separate from weapons. So this is a grenade on screen. It's a purple one, and we can see that it has a bunch of parts. Now, the crazy thing about this is we'll note that this is a Tediore grenade, but instead of rolling other manufacturers, like getting like Torg, for example, on this, or Malawan, it's got something called Lingering Payload, Duration Augment, and Concussive. Now, I was very confused on this stuff, so I asked Gearbox, and I've gotten a little bit more clarification. I'm still a little uncertain on some things, but I'll do my best to explain. So every grenade, different ordinances are going to work differently. You know, there's like rocket launchers, LMGs, and stuff, but for grenades specifically, every grenade has a unique manufacturer detonation. So the unique detonation with Tediore grenades, for example, is if you double click it like a C4, you can explode it. You don't need to wait for a fuse time for Tediore grenades. And then every different grenade also comes with a payload mod. So this mod is Lingering Payload, which lashes out at nearby enemies, dealing shock damage. But for example, this could be like theoretical, I don't know this for a fact, like Merv Payload, where it spawns a bunch of little grenades, right? So that can roll on anything. Lingering Payload can roll on anything. But then different payloads get a bunch of different augments. And so this is a duration augment on Lingering Payload, which makes the duration longer of this payload, but it could have been like more damage or bigger AoE, for example. And then every epic grenade gets a stat adjustment. And in this case of this grenade, the stat adjustment is concussive. And so Ordnance is a whole lot more complicated and crazy than weapons, it sounds like, because they're not abiding by the strict part rule, and they're getting a whole bunch more of these like augments and stuff. But like guns can get pretty crazy too, because they can get like different underbarrel attachments and all of that stuff. But what like really blew my mind is I was running around with a throwing axe that was considered ordnance. So it was like kind of a grenade, but it was a throwing knife, and it was deleting everything. It was one-tapping most enemies I threw it at, and I tapped the guy standing next to me who was a Gearbox employee, and I was like, yo, this is really cool, but it only hits one enemy. Is it possible to roll a Jacobs part on this thing and then get a Jacobs throwing knife that ricochets to enemies? And he's like, yep, that's entirely possible. So if I'm understanding it correctly, not only can these roll these like payload and like augments, but they could also, in addition, roll like multiple manufacturer parts. I don't know if that is totally true. I'm not totally sure if it is just like one part or another, but from what I was told, it does sound like you can get additional like manufacturers on grenades, but it does sound like there's going to be like a consistent, like a payload with an augment, or maybe just always having a payload, because obviously as a grenade, it needs to explode in some way. But grenades, ordnance, the whole shebang is going to be way crazier because they follow kind of different rules. Now, I do want to say that I did kind of have one big concern about this license parts system going into playing Borderlands 4 that I think for the most part has been dissuaded. And that was, I was worried that guns were going to start feeling very samey in that, like, if any weapon you pick up can get thrown like a TDR, will a TDR still feel like a TDR, or is everything going to feel like a TDR? I was a little bit worried that weapons would feel pretty samey, and I can say that, like, from the little bit of gameplay that I got to play, weapons still maintained their, like, manufacturer identity. If I picked up a Maliwan weapon, it felt like shooting a Maliwan weapon. I could identify it as a Maliwan weapon. If I picked up a Jacobs, it felt like I was shooting a Jacobs. I think that might get a little bit more blurry once you get into, like, crazier and crazier weapon parts. But for what I got to play, that wasn't the case. Now, the only other concern that I have with this license parts system is I hope Gearbox is prepared to potentially have some interesting balancing issues on their hands. We've never had a system like this in a Borderlands game, and I think we could have some cases arise where, like, a certain weapon, let's say the Hellwalker, is a pretty average weapon if it doesn't roll with Torgue stickies. But when it does roll with Torgue stickies, all of a sudden an interaction arises where it's busted. And so, like, how do you balance that? Because the gun itself isn't busted, but, like, a certain interaction with it could be. And so I think it could be kind of interesting, you know, in Borderlands 3. If the Hellwalker is too powerful, you nerf it, then that fixes the issue. If there's a 1 in 100 attachment or licensed part combination roll on one weapon that makes it the strongest thing in the game, how do you balance around that? So I think that'll be all interesting, but honestly, I'm kind of excited for it. All the chaos of all the different roles and all the gear possibilities. At the end of the day, I do think that the pros of the license parts system far outweigh the cons. And I think the build crafting and, like, you know, the kind of feeling of getting a weapon that, like, could potentially be really unique to you that other players don't have is going to be awesome. So that is going to do it for my deep dive into the license parts system. I hope you guys enjoyed. I will catch y'all in the next one, guys. Take care. Peace.